evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Guest of Honor, Senior Parliamentary State for Education, Associate Professor Faisal Ibrahim, His Excellency Mr. Santiago Miralles, Ambassador of Spain to Singapore, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you very much this evening for coming all the way up here to Fort Canning Hill, giving up your precious Saturday evening time to join us for this Meet the Authors session for the newly launched second edition, or the update of the book 700 Years, A History of Singapore. I'd like to first invite our guest of honor, SPS Associate Professor Faisal Ibrahim, to perhaps open the evening with a few words, if you could.
His Excellency Santiago Miralles, Ambassador of Spain, Madam Mochi, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all. Very happy to be able to join you this evening for the book signing session of 700 Years, A History of Singapore. I'd like to congratulate the four authors of Yong, my colleague, my former colleague, Prof. Peter Borschberg, Mr. Kwa Chong Guan, and Prof. Heng on the launch of this book. I think very, very good response so far. And what you're holding in your hands, some 30, 40 years of this historians' collective research. So it's really amazing account and experience and sharing about Singapore's history. This revamped edition of an earlier 2009 publication, A 700-Year History from Early Emporium to World City, is a timely update for the bicentennial year. I understand that there have been significant updates to the book, including new insights from non-British sources, namely Dutch, French, and Portuguese, and this complements the accounts from Malay sources. Also, new discoveries and insights into historical sources in the past 10 years have been added into the book. Taken together, all these present a fuller understanding of Singapore's history, especially in the pre-colonial period, from what we know. Well, you may ask, why is this book so significant, right? And what does it mean for us Singaporeans? First, it is the only single volume that comprehensively covers the 700 years of Singapore's history. Many gaps in our history have been filled in the past 10 years, and our historical narrative between the 15th to the 19th century is now made complete with recent discoveries from European sources. So many of these corroborate with the Malay sources that we have on hand. Secondly, it also showcases how rich we are in terms of our history. We were not a sleepy fishing village. Neither did we suddenly appear overnight after Raffles came to our shores. In the book, there's a lovely illustrated fold-out that reconstructs 14th century Fort Canning, where we are presently in, and the north bank of the Singapore River. The artifacts discovered on this hill and around the river bank shows of the diversity of people and trade here since the 14th century. There was so much happening here that we did not know of before, and this book allows us to uncover this. I'm sure the journey continues as we try to reach out to more people, but this whole process has been quite significant for us. It also shows how our past is connected to the region and the world. What happened here is very much linked to what happened worldwide. even in terms of climate. For example, the mini ice age, which saw the rise and fall of port cities. You know, I've been speaking to many people about the experience as well as the book. I must share that the response has been very, very positive. Even before I came here, I spoke to my son, who shared with me that his friends who are in the 19-year-old, and in the teenage years, they are very excited about this experience and the book. He even shared with me that they feel very happy that such a publication of such a book, and also the enrichment process, as well as how we are able to connect to young people like him and his classmates, I think shows something that our young people, I think they are aware and they are concerned about the historical development in Singapore, especially they want to know more about Singapore's history. And I feel happy as a member of parliament and also an SPS for Ministry of Education. I feel happy that when I hear young people, especially students, are interested in our history, because these are things that they learn in school and it goes beyond their school curriculum. And they want to feel aware about our history. And when they realize that there is an update and there are new discoveries, I think what they feel is that not only them, they feel that the younger generation will also get to know our history better. So I want to thank the authors as well as the team for making such a great effort in doing so, because it will provide our younger generation a rich substance and knowledge as part of understanding our history. So I'm very excited about these new discoveries means for our students. Presently in school, students learn about pre-1819 Singapore history and the contribution of key individuals and communities in the development of Singapore through the primary social studies and lower secondary history syllabuses. As we uncover new historical evidence of Singapore's history in recent years, including those documented in the 700 Years book, this will be incorporated in the upcoming school textbook and curriculum. For one, there will be more information included in Singapore's pre-1819 history. I went for many Hari Raya visits. One of the things that few of my relatives and friends asked me, are they going to be incorporated in our syllabus? So I assured them, yes, it is going to be incorporated. And I saw smiles, happiness, so that because they think of the younger generation, they want the younger generation to know our history better. So I also heard that the 700-year book at Fort Canning Centre is one of the top-selling items at the merchandise store we have set up here for visitors after they have gone through the time traveller segment of the bicentennial experience. So this is something good news that we are hearing. And so far, as I've said earlier, people are looking forward to read and to own the book. So this is extremely heartening. It means that there is curiosity and interest in learning more about our history, and that is key, right? And what I feel is that when one knows one's history, especially our nation, it somehow connects one's better. Because at the end of the day, you feel a sense of belonging, a sense of pride of our country. More so, if you look back and you see elements of self-determination, multiculturalism, as well as openness, being in existence since the early days. Then you realize this is the Singapore I know today, and this was also a Singapore in the past. So that really connects you to your nation, your country, Singapore. So I'd like to once again congratulate the 4 authors on putting together this book. This is truly a monumental work in the canon of our history text, and I hope it will spur more research by younger historians and academics to build upon this solid foundation of our 700-year journey. So on that note, I wish you a great evening. Thank you.
May I now invite the 4 authors to come on stage to join SPS, and can I invite Mr. Kwa to begin the book 700 years? Thank you very much, SPS, for opening our meeting. Once again, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. In a way, it feels like a very friendly evening because I have known all our 4 authors for a very long time. And I also see friendly faces in the audience. I see also Professor Huang Jianyi, who also taught me. I see a couple of former students who were in university with me at the same time. Prof Tan was, I think, HOD when I was doing my master's. Dr. Borschberg was a very young professor when I first took this course. He's still very young. He's still very young. So we go back a long, long way. And I got to know Mr. Kwa when I was working in the museums. And Derek, we were figuring out, when did we meet each other in university? Derek was doing his field work when I was doing my master's at the history department. So we go back, all a very long way. And so I hope this evening is going to just be something that's a little bit casual and a bit friendly. We'll start off first, with some questions between me and the authors, just to give us a better sense of the book. As questions goes, we'll start with warm-up questions. Okay, and I think the first question that I think I would direct to each one of you is, what was the genesis of this book, 700 Years? Yes, perhaps I could give this first to
Well, let me tell you about the history of this history book. It all started about 20 years ago when I was a young man. And we had then taught a course. I was asked to teach a course in Singapore history. And I decided to frame that history differently because we were used to having history courses or modules, as they were called, on rise of nationalism, Singapore nationalist history, and making a modern Singapore, the road to nationalism and all that sort of thing. And I wanted to frame that history differently by looking at how Singapore was formed as a result of outside forces. And we call the course the making of a global city-state. In other words, how Singapore has evolved as a global city-state, shaped by forces outside its shores, regional, international developments. So that was how we got the course together, and then I got someone that will teach it, and Derek to help us as well. So as a result of teaching the courses for a few years, we gathered some materials and we wrote lectures and we decided there wasn't a single textbook that we could use to help students frame the history the way that we were teaching it. So we decided to put together our course materials, our writings, different aspects of our writings in a single volume, and that was where the first volume, the 700-year history from Emporium to Global City, was first conceived and formed. Now, those of you who have seen that earlier volume would realize that there were many issues with that volume, and we ourselves acknowledge that. And that was because it was put together as a collection of different essays. So the framing, the chronology, the thematic things that came together made it, well, it was a useful text, but it did not have the kind of coherence that we were looking for. Now, for many years after that book was published, 10 years ago, we talked about wanting to redo that book, but all four of us were very busy with our own work and we never got together. But coming of the bicentennial allowed us to gather again and say, let's focus our energies and get this book out now for the bicentennial, essentially to tell the story of a longer history beyond the 200 years history of Singapore. And for the last year or so, we've been working on revising each chapter that we have written. And the book is actually a very substantial rewrite. It's not just a kind of update, but it was a rewrite. So the chapters have been formed very differently, so it's one chapter per century. We've incorporated new research, new readings, new materials that have emerged over the last 10 years. And what we have now is this current version, which is the 700 years history of Singapore. Now, we were very conscious of the title. We wanted to call it A History of Singapore because we acknowledge that this is not the definitive last word on the history of Singapore, as SBS Rajul has reminded us. But we hope that through this account, we could trigger more research, because you can imagine trying to squeeze long, complex histories into chapters that only deals with 100 years each. Now, there are lots of questions we hope the book will address, and we hope that Singaporeans, young Singaporeans, will be sufficiently enthused to now take up the challenge of discovering, digging deeper, and making the deeper connections. And we hope that history will also not be just a history of a group of people to govern Singapore, but a history of the people who made Singapore. So we hope that by spreading the base, we will have a richer, deeper history of Singapore. So that's the genesis of this book. And this is where we've gotten to, and we hope that even in the next 5 years, there will be new history books that will stretch what we have done thus far.
When the first book was being written and we were working on the course at the National University of Singapore, that provided us with a framework of what was actually critically important as we were looking at the history of Singapore over a significant period of time. One of the things that we didn't have before the middle of the last decade in the history of Singapore was in fact an understanding of the depth, the chronological depth of the country's experience, Singaporeans' experience, its people, and what were the critical issues that kept occurring again and again and again over a 700-year period. So that actually was a very important question that we needed to ask. And of course, all of us were working on different aspects of history as well. And Chong Guan and Peter will sort of explain a little bit about what they do over the last 10, 20 years in terms of their research and how that flowed into this book that we've got right now. But I was looking at the diplomatic and economic history between island Southeast Asia and China from roughly about the 10th century to the middle of the 15th century. And of course, Singapore was part of all of that nexus that was going on. It was one of the states in island Southeast Asia that was significantly affected by the ebbs and flows in China in terms of its politics, its economic policies, and so on and so forth. But also looking at how then states in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, were reacting to those changes very far away and trying to survive and prosper in those sorts of changing contexts. And that really sort of created the broader framework that we were moving away from the nation state per se and looking at the history of Singapore from a regional and global perspective. And that required us obviously to have a long lens in terms of the chronology. And so that's the reason why the depth of the chronology of the book is quite deep as far as we can go, and also the reach laterally in terms of the space as far as we can go, not just in Southeast Asia and East Asia, but obviously eventually in the early modern period from the 15th century onwards, involving Europe as well.
Well, let me add here a footnote to what Yong said, because I'm not sure whether he realized when he invited Derek and me to tutor the course, what he was opening himself to. Yong, you know, is a modern historian. He basically 19th, 20th century. Both of us, we started pushing it further and further back. And I think Yong at some point was a bit uncomfortable, but he was gracious enough to accept it. And we could push this idea of Singapore's history as a port city back simply because in 1984-83, the old National Museum invited Dr. John Nixon to come and do the first archaeological excavations on Fort Canning. And against the odds, we found, I think, about 15 kg of shards that could be clearly dated to the 14th century, and therefore confirming what the Malay annals had said, that there was a settlement here, a great city here, that we all taken as a myth. And over the years, Dr. John Nixon and a succeeding generation of archaeologists, Mr. Lin Chen Sen, now have accumulated some 9 tons of stuff. So that's clear evidence that Singapore in the 14th century was a fairly thriving regional entrepôt. 9 tons of Chinese porcelains, local earthenwares. The problem was then between the end of the 14th century, 1396, 97, 98, all that, and Raffles, what was there? Nothing. Black hole. No evidence. I mean, was there, but we didn't know where to find it. It's all in the Portuguese Dutch archives. And we had some inkling of this in the early work of people like Heng and Gregor. So, when Peter Borschberg started showing an interest in this, and he will talk about it from his brochure's point of view, I invited him, Peter, there's this very interesting map of this battle of Changi. And we were then in 1998 planning an exhibition, which we appropriately entitled John Nixon himself and Iskandar Shah Museum, Singapore's 700th anniversary. And Peter was kind enough to write a long caption for that map which he was talking about. So slowly from then on, we have been accumulating the evidence that were not amounting to a continuous history of Singapore, showed that there were cycles of settlement in Singapore history. And the issue here, the basic issue here that all four of us are working on is this paradox of Singapore history. How can we claim that Singapore is strategically located, you know, the mantra ascribed, connecting the South China Sea with the Bay of Bengal, the Great Eastern, and nothing happened. If you want to follow Raffles, Singapore may be the Malta of the East. Now, Malta was fought over, colonized for 1,000 years. Where is the evidence that Singapore was, as a strategic location, similarly fought over, colonized, occupied? None. Was it because the historians were lax? We never looked hard enough? So that was one direction. People like the geographer Paul Quigley, others, searched Chinese sources. Nothing. I think the record is only about 12 references to Singapore before 1400, 1300. So, the paradox, what happened, how, and that was what Mr. Derek and myself we were trying to put in context. Why only in the 14th century was there a settlement of Singapore and not before? And to get the answer, you have to very carefully read the book. It's very
Well, if you read the preface, you will know that I was not part of the original team. I'm not really a historian of Singapore, not trained as one certainly, and I came from the angle of European and the history of trade and maritime history. And I remember that dinner at John Nixon's house where I was presented with this map, schematic backbook, map that should be read a bit like a comic strip. You read it from left to right. And the caption intrigued me because it was written in German. And they had asked me, well, where does this even come from? So it took me some time and some voyages into the archives to find out exactly what particular episode that map was based on. And it just happened to be very close to something else that I had been working on.
Page 124.
Very good. And I had worked on the so-called Santa Catarina incident. This is the robbery by the Dutch of a carrack coming from Japan and China in the waters off the eastern coast of Singapore. And it was famously defended by Grotius in 1609 in his Freedom of the Seas, and became his first engagement with international law, and then made him into one of the great pathfinders or forefathers of our international legal system. What had happened with this episode, as I found out, is that the Portuguese, they were quite miffed about all of this, and they decided they would teach these Johorese a bit of a lesson. And so they sent a squadron down from Malacca, and they decided to impose a blockade on the river. And that all worked very nice until the Dutch showed up. And it didn't end with the engagement with the Dutch. They managed to disperse the vessels, but they regrouped, and the situation lingered for some time. And that was really the beginning of my engagement with all of this. And in subsequent years, as every time I went into the archives in different parts of Europe and was looking for manuscripts, I found a new interesting episode that I could talk about. And so over the years, the material I worked on, and specifically the questions I was working out, grew quite substantially. To the extent now that I think I have been able to work on 3 of the chapters in this book, the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, to different levels. Chong Guan helped me in the 18th century. I was a bit less familiar in there, but then again, 2 years ago, I worked through 4,000 pages of Dutch foreign ministry documentation on the negotiations between the British and the Dutch, specifically for their agreement, the Anglo-Dutch agreement. And there's some really interesting things that came out of that. So again, I have to say, you need to read the book. And it does change the story quite a bit on how this came about. And it certainly changed my idea of what it is that Raffles actually achieved. I put him there at the end of the 18th century as a risk taker, and that, in my opinion, is his real achievement. He took a gamble and he won in the end.
And so, there's this adage that, when you have many cooks in the kitchen, it kind of, causes some kind of risk to the soup. But, we've managed to pull that together, and I think the 4 authors have come together, in a very coherent way in this book. And I just wanted to ask, what is the difference between this book and the earlier edition then, and how did the 4 authors then come to a consensus about what needs to be in the update?
Well, the first edition was reluctantly put together by the 3 of us at the request of the former director of the National Archives, Mr. Kwa Chong Guan, and I think we should acknowledge him there, that he was the one who persuaded us that we should compile what we'll be teaching to our students into a book. All time. And so we managed to get some editorial assistance, and we cobbled together, but there wasn't enough time to do a good job. So the problem with that early edition was that it mixed up themes. So one chapter on readings of Malayu, one chapter on South China trade, And then suddenly you get one chronological chapter about 16th, 17th century, and then one chapter on raffles, and then 19th, 20th century, which essentially goes back to the Singapore story. And so several cohorts of students had to make sense of that book. And we left it at that. It was put in footnotes, but there were never any footnotes also put in. So it was an inadequate book in hindsight, and when the opportunity came with Jin Han and the bicentennial, you must do something for this occasion now. Okay. And so this is when, with hindsight, 10 years now, we could do a more coherent chapter in which we gave one chapter to each century of history. So that's how it has panned out, with a beginning and a conclusion. And so you got about what, 80,000 word book there. Am I right when the publisher is there? It's for 80,000 words, isn't it? The book? Or the book down on 90?
It was,
yeah, about that. So that was how, huh?
A PhD thesis.
Exactly, a PhD thesis by 4 people. So the writing was, as Peter admitted here, alluded to, each of us wrote certain chapters, but we all went through each other's chapters and quite considerably rewrote each other's words. And we are still friends after this, rewriting, and the senior author here is going to invite us for dinner after this.
I think one of the things that really differs, and Prof. Tan was right when he said that this is actually a new book, although we keep saying that it's a revamp of the old one. It is effectively a new book because when the first book was published in 2009, a lot of the ingredients were actually missing. The state of scholarship for a lot of things that we were working on was just not at the level of depth and maturity that it is right now. And so one of the big differences between this current book and the one that was published about a decade ago is if you look at the bibliography of all the chapters at the end of the book, it is not a comprehensive bibliography, but it does represent probably the bulk of the cutting edge research in all these different areas of research that's in the book, chapter by chapter. And if you look at the dates of a lot of these publications and research is done, a lot of them have actually been published after 2009. And so, in effect, the first volume opened up a lot of questions for us that we needed to answer ourselves. And it's actually taken a long time for us to be able to do that. The other thing that's been really great, at least as an author, because writing as a historian can be a really lonely affair. But this particular project has been wonderful because it was so different. Peter was my lecturer when I was an undergraduate student. And anyway, so that gives you an idea, of the kind of age gap and age span that we're talking about here in terms of the depth of my experience. And it has been really wonderful just working with the other 3 authors, critiquing each other's work, and actually being able to remember one email where I actually sent to Peter and I said, well, I disagree with you, full stop, and left it at that. And he did not come back and go, no, but you need to change it or you're not going to get your A. So it's been wonderful. I mean, I've been able to disagree on a lot of things, but it has allowed for us, I think, to work collaboratively to really produce something that we would not have been able to do, I think, if we had done it on our own. So that is also the other really big difference in this book that was not there in 2009.
Apart from the fact that when we, with the Bicentennial Office, was conceptualizing the bicentennial experience and the different programs and products that go with it, we based our research very much on the first edition of the book, and then we later on also worked very closely on the publication of this book. So apart from the fact that 700 years provides, the core of the narrative of our bicentennial project, why is it important or timely to be reissuing this book, 700 Years of History, during the bicentennial?
I think here you're looking at learning the lessons of history, which are also for the same, then if you were to reframe and look at Singapore in the longer period history, the driving forces, as we are born to say, it's in our planning, then, yeah, in the last 200 years, it was British colonialism. Last 100 years or last 50 years, it was American. But if you go back before that, it is China. It is the China market that's there in the 10th century, 11th, 12th century, 13th, 14th century. So we always come back here. If you look at the long history, China was the key driving force. When the Chinese market closed, that's it. We also went down the tube for that. So at the end of the Yuan dynasty, the market went. And only when the Ming came up, Malacca came up with the Ming. But again, you've got to read the history. There's a very complicated history. Southeast Asia's relations with the Ming, or Ming in Southeast Asia, Zheng He, and all that. So when the Ming went down, we also went down. Johor went down, we went down. So there is a very close connection here between the cycles of the Chinese market and the historical development of Southeast Asia. I don't know whether they can add to that.
I guess one of the things that sort of we were reminded about in writing this long history is that Singapore's existence as a nation state is but a blip in this long history. We are 54 years old as a nation state, I think 55. But we have a 700-year history. So how do we position our current position as a nation state in that broad sweep of history? And here is where we were hoping to draw continuities, cycles, as well as disruptions and changes, and how those will impact status of Singapore, whether it's a port polity, it's part of some empire, or a nation state. So these continuities and these disruptions that happen in history are likely to repeat themselves if you project another 700 years ahead. So how does Singapore deal with this sort of disruptions, and whether this can be controlled or not, are the kinds of lessons that perhaps a long frame of history can remind us that, don't think that we've arrived, because no matter how successful Singapore is today, there will always be these challenges that will continue to come our way, as history has shown. And what's going to happen to Singapore when we draw those lessons is something that behoves us to think about the things that perhaps hold us together, and we frame it in terms of certain values, right? Openness, multiculturalism, self-determination, because these could be certain core things that hold Singapore together, no matter what form Singapore takes, you see. And if you read Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's second memoirs, the last page of his second memoir, he actually asked that question: will Singapore survive as a nation state? Nation states, or city-states. City-states do not have long histories. Venice, 400 years, one of the longest. And what's going to happen to Singapore? He said, as an island, Singapore will be here. But what happens after that? Nobody knows. So these are interesting questions that we hope a longer understanding of history will raise for us to think about. We may not have the answers, but at least it behoves us to really reflect upon the long-term future of Singapore, looking backwards and then projecting forward.
Then, how does the account of our history then differ from the more conventional narratives that people have become accustomed to from our history curriculum? How does what are the different types of accounts of Singapore's history that we have encountered in this book, and how is the historiography different from what authors and readers are accustomed to?
So let me try to answer that question, because it's actually not as simple as we think. Historiography is actually a very complex thing, and it's based on quite a number of factors. One, who the audience is. Two, who are the ones who actually pay for the writing of the history. But seriously, three, the historian's lens, and so on and so forth. And so what you have is a mix of combination of factors that then lead to the production of a historical narrative, right? Of a version of the past, like a version or many versions of the past. And I think one of the things that has really sort of, as a historian of Singapore, I have been always very intrigued and more recently really happy about what's been going on, because I think we've come to a point as a society where we are comfortable about prodding, the spaces of the past which we may have left alone in the past in terms of our history. So that's why we're more willing to ask questions and try to find the answers so that we can learn from the past and see how we can actually project, and moving forward and so on and so forth. The other thing, of course, is Singapore society is very different from what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And because of the demographic difference, the way we see ourselves will necessarily shift as well. So every generation will look at this as a core narrative, but every generation will look at that core narrative and the stories that we sort of embellish it with very differently, because it has to speak to that generation at that time. And so as we move, this today it will be this book, right? 10 years ago was the other book. 20 years down the road it will be a different one, and that's totally fine, because what it means is that history is alive in this society. It would be really sad if we had the one narrative for 50 years and it never changed, or that it was never sort of, questions were never asked. So to me, that's actually a really wonderful thing. And my hope is that actually we'll be able to spur interest in the younger generation. Not everybody can be a historian, but everybody can be historically minded. And so you can ask questions about the past, look at ourselves in the present society, and have all these sorts of thoughts. And I think that that's what we really hope, as historians who teach history, that those are one of the things that we really hope that we can impart, and that we'll have more narratives of Singapore come out.
I think Derek is absolutely right to talk about methodology, but we also have new types of sources coming online that we didn't really think about before. Traditionally, if you look at the Mary Turnbulls or some of these other documentary-based histories of Singapore, these are all very text-heavy. John Miksic brought the idea or the discipline of archaeology to Singapore, but there are other things. We now have scientific evidence. We think about things like rain, precipitation, and climate change. The first stage in your atrium there, as you come in for the bicentennial experience, talks about climate change in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And these are important considerations. We now look much closer at things like cartography than we used to, or even oral sources, such as they exist, and providing they exist mainly for more recent memories that have been captured in Singapore historiography. So it's also the range of sources we're looking at rather than just the methodologies. And I think the two are very powerful in unison.
Well, here, I think we have in this, in our two editions, tried to give a bit more perspective, emphasis to a Malay understanding. One criticism of the early edition was that it didn't say sufficient about the Sejarah Melayu and the Bugis and the Malay. He wrote them out. Well, I hope our critics for that point of view will now see, or be able to trace in this new edition a fairly continuous argument that the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay annual story, has some basis, and it was in the Malay social memories and shaped their response, their reaction to the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British when they arrived. To understand Sultan Hussein, why he came to Singapore and was prepared to sign the agreement draft, was you have to understand the Malay annals and the narrative that it speaks to. Yeah. So we're trying to give that point of view.
Just one last one, and then we can hold it with the floor. The chapter is, the book is now kind of written in a way where every chapter is, every century is presented in a chapter. And so what, as authors of each chapter, what is the key takeaway
that we would like readers to be able to, have when they read for each of the chapters? I think it started with you right there.
Yeah. 14th century. Yeah. So for the 14th century, which is the first chapter, I think the key takeaway is that you do need to have the right conditions internationally and locally in order for certain kinds of settlements to actually emerge in Southeast Asia. And there's actually a lastability in terms of how those factors actually are important. So as we read it, it's important to bear that in mind. It's also important, as many of you will realize, that the most attractive piece of thing in the chapter is the infographics. One thing about infographics, as much as it is dependent on the data that we have, it is also imagined. And so think of that as a work in progress, because with time and more information that we will have, that infographic actually will also change. So that actually is the big takeaway for 14th century. Please do not go away thinking that all of that is set in stone. It is not. And but nonetheless, there are some important points about how settlements come up in places like Singapore, and that's really sort of the big point for the chapter.
Well, I think rather than try to respond to Sam's question, what exactly was in the chapter on Malacca and Johor, it would be far quicker that you read that final paragraph in each chapter in a nutshell. And you have to thank our bicentennial office colleagues who are journalists and were able to say, look, you must put it in. And I said, nutshell. It sounds terrible. But that's the word that people understand. So it became in a nutshell. So just read that final paragraph in every chapter and then go back to the beginning of the chapter.
I suppose for the Malacca chapter, I mean, you tell me if you disagree, he wrote that, didn't he? It is about how the Orang Laut played a role in Singapore's society originally, and later when they transferred and set up in Malacca, this co-optation of forces that took place, and Singapore's role within that Malaccan, for the lack of a better word, empire that then emerged, a trading empire. For the 16th century, I'd say it is the revival of Singapore as a port under the Shah Bandar. Yeah?
14th century, Malacca, 16th century, Shah Bandar.
Shah Bandar, it actually comes onto the radar screen of the European powers.
The best port.
The best port, as Jacques de Couta says, at the end of the 16th century, it's one of the best ports that serves the East Indies. It also serves as the gatekeeper, strategically and commercially, to the upstream towns of the Johor River. The 17th century is about contested space. This is where Singapore and the Straits region in general come under the contested area of the Dutch and united Portuguese and Spanish empires. The 18th century is also about contested space, but the agents are different. We have the Bugis, we have Raja Ketchu from Siak, and we have especially, and you tell me if you disagree with this, the marginalization of the Orang Laut, who originally had played such an important role from ancient Singapore and Malacca onward until the 18th century. They are gradually marginalized or given a marginal position. And this is really, I think, one of the core messages of the 18th century. Yeah? Would you agree with that?
So the last two chapters, 19th and 20th centuries, essentially revisit the underlying themes of this entire volume. And there are two connected themes. One is Singapore as a port city. So towards the end of the 20th century, it positions itself as a global city, but at its core, it remains a port city which needs to be open, connected, and which then depends on external factors for its own fortunes. And that's the second theme that's connected, that Singapore has always in a way, I think, at the expense of, develops at the expense of external larger forces beyond shores. So the 19th, 20th century shows that in abundance, right? Empire, the opening up of Singapore as a settlement, and then as a port city of empire, and then the diaspora that came, populated the island state, and then opening of the Suez Canal, steamship, opening of Malaya, then the war, and the naval base, and then Singapore's independence, and then the need to, as Rajaratnam then articulated in 1972, the need to position itself as a global city-state. So these were the themes that connected, I guess, the whole volume, and the 19th and 20th century highlight those themes.
Okay, we've got some couple of minutes. Yes, questions. Hi, Judy. We have a mic up there.
You want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad. I'm glad to see this book. I'm looking forward to reading it, and I've attended many of your lectures as well on your own. So never the four of you together. So that's quite exciting. I wanted to ask about Singapore's relationship with our other Asian countries. I know you mentioned China and all that, and I wanted to ask whether or not in that book, or maybe in the next book, is there sufficient, and that's a big word, right? Sufficient mention of Singapore's relationship with Japan, Imperial Japan. I was just also in Phnom Penh, and the Khmer dynasty, and also Vietnam, several hundred years ago, is not what it is today, and we don't seem to have an understanding of that. Certainly Myanmar in the British times, that was a cat's meow after India. We don't seem to know too much about that. And so Imperial Japan is definitely, I think, a bigger player in Singapore than just, you know, the 3 years of occupation that we seem to just go over and over, and it's really distressing for me to see that. So do you cover those countries, or should they be covered in this 700 years?
In what era? I mean,
So specifically on Japan, let me just try to address the period that's before the early modern period. There is actually no linkage between Singapore, for example, and Japan. Most of the linkages is from Southeast Asia to Japan, or primarily indirect through China. That's just the way that the networks operated prior to about the 15th, 16th century. As the Europeans came in, then that does change the picture somewhat, because the Europeans are engaged with the trade in Nagasaki and so on and so forth. Peter will be able to answer that a little better. On the issue of Southeast Asia, though, I think this book will demonstrate that there is significant linkage with the rest of Southeast Asia, and how did Singapore, society in Singapore, the strategicness of Singapore actually played into the rest of the region. The notion of the regional histories and how it actually affects Singapore actually comes out very strongly in this book. And so I think you will find it throughout the entire book. And just a plug, at 7:30 I'll be giving another lecture on 14th century Singapore and diversity of American port city in the 14th century. There actually is significant linkage. You can actually see a lot of that evidence with Southeast Asia that leads to the kind of what we call cosmopolitanism and diversity in the society in Singapore in the 14th century. And so, you know, if you're interested at 7:30, I'll talk a little bit about that. Peter, you want to add something?
If you count the number of pages on the Japanese occupation, 3 years and 9 months, it's 7 years. I think we are still excessively giving 6 pages in the book on the Japanese occupation. I would have to reduce it to 3 pages or less. And if you look, we've also reduced the number of mentions of Raffles and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
Let me just answer that also. For the early modern period, we do have quite extensive linkages to other parts of Asia. We have spoken about the linkages to Java, to Sulawesi. to Ryukyu, which later got absorbed into Japan, and Burma would have then been known as the Kingdom of Pegu. Pegu is the largest supplier of rice in the region and other food items. So yes, Siam always took an interest in this part of the peninsula, and even at some time claimed it every now and then. We talked about the Majapahit, and of course, if you go to the bicentennial experience, Aceh plays a very important role in the 17th century when it overruns Batu Sawar in Singapore.
There's a lot more to be done on this connected history of Singapore to its neighbors.
It pains me. It's a very, I mean, we could go on and on because it's all very interesting and we want to hear more from the authors, but I've been signaled that, I need too much time. We are going to go on to reception, but this is also the moment where we're going to begin to sign books as well. So while if you have any questions, you can approach the authors individually with the questions after this. And I did mean to plug, I didn't forget that, Derek is going to also give us a lecture at 7:30. So those of us who can, please do stay there and join us for that. It was part of the evening program as well. The book, we must acknowledge our publishers, Marshall Cavendish, and also want to thank the National Library Board for helping us to project manage the entire project. This has really been a very lovely collaborative partnership with both Marshall and the NLB as well. And finally, Bicentennial Experience. Those of you who have tickets to see the show tonight, you're very lucky. All weekends are sold out for now, but we have opened up the bookings for July time slots. So I really hope very much that you guys can come and join us for that. Okay? Now I'm going to shut up. I'm going to zip now. And give the space to the authors for their book signing. And please do join us for refreshments as well. Thank you very much.